Welcome, everybody, to the South by Southwest panel on how sports washing is changing the game. My name is Karim Zidan, and I'm an investigative journalist covering the intersection of sports and politics for outlets such as The Guardian and Right Wing Watch. Joining us on the panel are legendary chess grandmaster and Human Rights Foundation chairman Garry Kasparov, Uyghur American activist and Human Rights Foundation Freedom Fellow Eradi Kashgari, as well as Miguel Delaney, chief football writer at The Independent. Now, Garry, sports washing is a term coined by Amnesty International to describe authoritarian regimes using sports to manipulate perception and cleanse human rights atrocities, essentially whitewashing them. While the term is new, the process is not. Many dictators have used this in the past and continue to do so in modern times. The Soviet Union is one of the most infamous examples of sports washing in the 20th centuries, whether it be, chess tournaments, the Olympic Games, football, wrestling. My question for you is, how has this evolved in Putin's Russia in modern times?
Thank you very much for this question because I think we should work on the definition just not to get our audience confused. Sports washing is not money laundering. It's similar, but it's more sophisticated. And you pointed out at the past experience. You mentioned Soviet Union, but we can also recall the experience of Nazi Germany organizing Berlin Olympics in 1936. Dictators always loved sport as a way to promote their agenda and to portray them, just in as popular, as strong leaders, both for domestic purposes but also internationally to cleanse their names. And Soviet Union extended this practice. I experienced it with FIDE, International Chess Federation, that had been under Soviet control for ages. It's still under Russian KGB control today as we speak. But today, I guess we're covering something else, something it's even more sophisticated, because it's not about using influence in the international organizations. It's about finding way by using money from this dictatorship to infiltrate the society in the free countries. So it's you may say it's a step down from international organizations to local sports club, but actually it's I would say in terms of buying influence, it's a step up. And Putin Russia pioneered this approach. Roman Abramovich, one of the closest Putin's allies, many call one of the Putin's wallets, started this program process concept by buying a Chelsea club. And Chelsea club is not just a football club; it's a symbol. It's an institution that was there virtually forever, as long as just we remember soccer, and it had massive following, and through Chelsea and through all people connected to Chelsea, and through of course TV and competitions where Chelsea took part, Abramovich managed to incorporate himself and his buddies into the British society. And we saw that this example that was successful had many followers, and more Russians did it. And we know that now it's no longer Russian prerogatives. We saw Saudis, for instance, trying to buy Newcastle. So it's a new phenomena. And I think it's just as we hopefully today we can help people to understand how this aggressive takeover threatens the very fabric of the society in the free world, because it seems like very innocuous. Okay, so what's a big deal? They have the football club, basketball club, baseball team, whatever. But it's not that simple. They corrupt societies in societies from within, and make them less sensitive to the human rights violations and to other crimes committed to the money that had been used to buy these institutions.
No, that absolutely makes sense, and it's an extremely subtle soft power tactic as well that a lot of people, look over and assume is not a significant one. So I agree with you entirely, Garry. Miguel, now you've reported on Russia's involvement in sports washing, in football mainly, through, oligarch Abramovich in Chelsea. Can you go into that in a lot more detail, explaining the significance of it, and maybe give us a few more examples to the audience of sports washing in football right now?
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking as Gary was talking now, we talk about the history of it, and it probably goes back much further even than kind of the Soviet Union of the 20th century, in that you could even argue that the first example of sports washing was basically Roman gladiatorial games and kind of bread and circuses. And it's probably not coincidental then that for the 1936 Olympics, which is really probably the first huge example of what we're talking about, they use Roman pageantry for that. But I think when I mean, there are so many examples of states like that using Olympic Games or World Cups. But I think when they go to own a football club or a sporting institution in that way, it takes it up a level. And because I think it goes so much deeper. And really, I think Gary used the term there. It's about inserting a country or a state or a regime into the very social fabric of everything around a football club. Because again, as Gary said, I mean, we're not just talking football teams. We're talking about social institutions that have been the centre of their local area for 120 years or longer, with all sorts of connected emotions and social links through that. And it's this basically that, you know, when sports washing is at its most insidious, that they're tapping into. I mean, I think in some of the reports I've done with this, you know, I've had various experts. I think it was Dr. Christian Ulrichsen who told me that it was it's basically about trying to portray themselves as benevolent accessories to things we've been enjoying for years, if not centuries. And it's about the most prominent examples. And I mean, Abramovich probably moved the dial in terms of football club ownership in that way. It was the first huge takeover in that sense, and in terms of the kind of money involved, it just completely shifted what football was, and also helped footballs move onto this fully global scale, which I don't think is really comparable in any other sport, I have to say. And you only have to look at the way Premier League clubs are supported all over the world. I think it does go across so many borders now. And I mean, people initially look to the financial outlay of this, but of course, for a lot of these regimes, it's not about financial return, because that's why they're pumping so much money in. It's about the kind of political capital or social capital. And so the real game changer after Abramovich was Sheikh Mansour, or as I think as many critics would say, Abu Dhabi, really, the state of Abu Dhabi, taking over Manchester City in 2008. And this has had all sorts of benefits for the image of Abu Dhabi. It's helped foster business and political connections in England. You know, through the ownership of Manchester City, Abu Dhabi now has built what is effectively a construction empire in the city of Manchester. And as a lot of people say, you know, it sometimes feels like social regeneration, which is what a lot of the construction was supposed to be about. Doesn't go beyond the walls of the Etihad campus. And there's another example there. Arsenal aren't owned by a state in that sense, but they do have a sponsorship deal with Emirates Airlines. People in England talk about going to the Emirates Stadium so freely. So once again, you have an apparatus of a state, Emirates Airlines, becoming just, you know, part of the language of football without people, without even thinking of it. 3 years after Manchester City, Qatar bought Paris Saint-Germain, and then most recently, and belatedly, a lot of people would say, following on from the example of their two neighbours, and a lot of people would really link it, of course, to the blockade in the Gulf, Saudi Arabia trying to buy Newcastle United, and what this is completely, it's looking to tap in to the emotion that football arouses. And I mean, I've talked to so many people on this, and almost the best way to put it is, it's very hard to ask questions. It's very hard for people to have the mental space, and this is a totally understandable thing, I have to say. Very people have the mental space to question a state's human rights record amid the euphoria of victory or sporting success. Often the people that waited years for. And on another level, again, this goes right up to government committees, to even about the approval of arms sales. It's a lot easier for basically governments or people in authority to point to a country investing in an area through sport, to show ultimately that these are good people to do business with. And I think that's where the idea of the washing part comes in, or, you know, the image laundering, in that it makes them look so much more benevolent in the West, and what they need kind of Western interests for.
Yes, they all are connected and just the same kind of operation, but still there's a slight difference between Emiratis and Qataris and Saudis and Russians, because in terms of Emirati construction empire or Qatari airline, it still looks like business, and it is a business. They have a business interest, so they mixed, as you said, washing of the image, presenting that's a very different picture of the country in the eyes of the followers of the club. While for Russians and Saudis, there's no business. I mean, Abramovich, didn't promote anything. It's all about sports washing. So again, it's a subtle difference. Yeah, just I wanted to mention that. But of course, at the end of the day, so that's all belongs to the same process. Though some of them are still doing business, while others, like Russian oligarchs, they just invest Putin's control money to promote Putin's agenda with no real business behind it.
In the end, I think the point stands the same with all the different countries, in that these end up being propaganda campaigns where dictatorships appear benevolent as benevolent leaders, and that leads to, of course, all sorts of diplomatic strategizing. There's a reason it was known as sports diplomacy as well. And I think this is a great time to talk to Irade, whose focus really is on Uyghur activism and China, etc. And of course, China has risen to become one of the most effective users of sports washing in the past, I'd say, over a decade now. Whether we're talking the 2008 Summer Olympic Games, the upcoming 2022 Winter Games. I mean, I can go on, the Club World Cup, and of course, the controversial relationship with the NBA. Now, Irade, can you explain to our audience why we should be paying attention to this right now?
Yeah, of course. And I think it'll kind of pull from what Gary and Miguel have already said, in the sense of how it makes dictatorships look very benevolent, right? And here, if you look at this picture that I provided here, it shows Xi Jinping speaking to these children, these young athletes. And this image itself is exactly what they benefit from it, right? This is exactly how it shows Xi Jinping is someone who's honest, who likes to work with kids, who's sweet, and gives almost a fatherly figure to him. And at the same time, this man is a dictator who is in charge of essentially running a full genocide against the Uyghurs right now. And these events, when you pull them in to these dictatorships, when you pull these dictatorships into these events, these dictators, they come off as almost human. You add this sense of humanity to them. And it makes it much harder for people to then react and say, hey, what they're doing is incorrect. What they're doing, we need to speak up about, whether it's in business, whether it's in public, condemnations of their actions. It makes it much harder, and it makes it much easier for businessmen to go ahead in the future and say, we're going to continue working with them because, look, he's not that bad of a guy, and we don't want to get too political. It's really easy to use that excuse once we have this avenue of sports to make them seem more human and make them seem more relatable.
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense, and that relates again to what Miguel was saying and what Gary was saying. Miguel, were you trying to say something?
Well, just picking up on something Irade said there about kind of, we don't want sport to be political. That's something you see a lot in this debate, and it's usually the most common counter-argument. And I think it's always worth addressing and stressing a point on it, in that it's nonsense. Sport is inherently political. It always has been. The very organisation of sport is often political. I mean, even if you look at the way certain teams are founded, certain organisations are founded, I mean, as a clearest possible example, you only have to look at sport in South Africa during the apartheid era. And just from the basic organisation of sport, it will always be inherently political. It will always be used by states, by people involved, and it's something that it's never going to go away, and because of its social power, which is itself political, it will always attract these interests, unless, of course, there's opposition to it or people make stands within sport, which is why I think the example of the Uyghur Muslims probably is currently so powerful in that regard.
Mm-hmm. It really shows the hypocrisy of a lot of these sports teams. So, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to follow this because I grew up in the Soviet Union, and we heard it. Sports is out of politics, and I was an athlete, and I knew that it was all nonsense. The big talk about, we have only amateurs in the Soviet Union. Of course, we're professionals. Of course, sport was political. So it's chess belonged to the ideological department of the Central Committee of the Communist Party. because it was seen as a very important tool, so to prove the intellectual superiority of the Soviet communism over decadent West. And going back to the 1936 Olympics, few people remember that it was not just Hitler who saw the value of that. It was the Axis powers, because a decision was made in Berlin in 1936 that next Olympics, 1940, to be held in Tokyo. And 1944 in Mussolini's Italy, in Rome. So they saw the opportunity to use sport to cover up their heinous crimes. And the Soviet Union and China and Russia these days, they all look at sport as a big opportunity to I'm not even sure about clearing their name, but the changing the image. It's more like an angle of observation. So you can look at the vigorous concentration camps, but you change the angle, and the lenses show Xi Jinping having kids surrounding him and having a nice chat. And even, if we follow the China NBA relations, it's not just, international. They succeeded in forcing Americans to basically abandon the First Amendment. So they already had opportunities through enormous investment and through, through the very lucrative Chinese market, the opportunity to be there, to force Americans to retreat on something that we all believe was a staple of American democracy.
Yeah, I think the hypocrisy is amazing to see, if anything. I think that the NBA situation recently with Daryl Morey had painted this perfectly, right? When he spoke out, and then immediately the NBA came back with one comment after another, saying how the NBA doesn't want to get involved and that the NBA wants to stay apolitical. But the NBA has been such a staple of political statements within the U.S. Matter of fact, a lot of its popularity with the NBA, a lot of support for players like LeBron come from the fact that they have been so outspoken. So how does it feel when LeBron is talking about equality here and then just goes to China and stays completely silent in that aspect? Is it because it's another country now that the NBA is purely an American sport and won't get involved in other countries' politics? Where does that line, where do you define that line?
Actually, it's
even worse than being silent. LeBron and others attacked those who wanted to raise their voice. So not that they decided to be neutral. They basically sided with Chinese communists to attack their own teammates, the NBA players and managers who tried to be vocal and to support fundamental human rights. And of course, with all due respect to the problems America is facing today, the racial reckoning, there's no comparison. It doesn't come close to the genocide, open genocide, that is, as we speak, happening in the Western China.
But again, it's why this whole example, I think, brings so many of the connected elements to this into a head and into one area. I mean, I suppose, as regards what you're saying with the NBA, you also have to look at the kind of even a simple example from when Mesut Ozil, the former Arsenal player, the German international of Turkish background, spoke out about the treatment of Uyghur Muslims, and Arsenal, his club, basically distanced themselves from the comments. They didn't do the same when one of his teammates, Hector Bellerin, spoke out about the Conservative Party in the UK. But I think, even beyond Arsenal, there's an issue there where because there was, at the time there was all sorts of talk about how in China Arsenal's games are pulled from the television, that Ozil basically was they didn't want him appearing anywhere. But I suppose what that illustrates is as much as anything, the power of the Chinese market for sport and sports broadcasters and the potential they see in it. Basically, I think it's seen as the where the next greatest growth is, and the other side of that is, of course, the power of the Chinese state to dictate that growth, and it's created, I think, a lot of contradictions and complications within sport, and as you say, this hypocrisy where there isn't that much discussion about it. And again, summing this up, we did have until the COVID crisis basically started to change the world. At this time last year, there was already talk about how this summer, 2021, FIFA was going to host their new expanded Club World Cup in China, and it was going to, and because they basically need huge prize money to attract the biggest clubs to this, to create a tournament on a par with the Champions League, they needed a lot of prize money, and a lot of the talk at the time was that prize money was going to come from Saudi Arabian investors.
This all emphasizes that the countries like China, like Russia, etc., but in this case, China use sports washing not just to promote their own message, but to undermine criticism of themselves as well, of the country. So it goes to show you the extreme power that something like sports washing has. In the case, and it varies from country to country, because we've now given examples across from the Middle East off to Russia, off to China, and each with slightly varied interests or stakes at hand or goals overall with this. And I'd like to go into more detail into these specific goals from various countries. And I want to go back to Russia here, circle back to Russia for a moment, because I think it's very interesting how Putin actually, like, we talk about Putin is not looking for any business interests, or it's not a business negotiation or sort of that kind of diplomacy the way it is with Qatar or with the United Arab Emirates. Well, then what is it, Gary, exactly that Putin is truly interested in? What does he personally achieve? Because he's not going to be around forever. So what is this for his legacy? What is this for the Russia he's trying to create?
Yeah, I doubt that Putin is thinking very much about his legacy. Yes, he's a dictator, but this is not, classical dictatorship of the 20th century. Hitler, Mussolini, Stalin, they could probably have their thoughts about, the legacy and the future. Putin is far more primitive. It's more like a mafia boss. So it's all about staying in power today, and surviving tomorrow morning. And what mafia does, buys influence. It blackmails, it attacks, it kills if necessary. So we saw that Putin doesn't hesitate to use brute force, whether against domestic opponents like Nemtsov or Navalny, or elsewhere in the world where he have to make a statement. Carpet bombing Aleppo was just part of his message to the world. I have my body there, in this case Bashar al-Assad, and I said he would stay, and I would do everything to protect him. So Abramovich experiment that was followed by many other Russian oligarchs and Russian companies was a part of this of the plan. It's a hybrid war against the free world, and to win this hybrid war, you need your agents, you need your infrastructure in the opponent's camp, and they succeeded. And it's why it's so difficult now to impose any sanctions on Russia. You can see them, just Russia violating every international treaty it signed. It spits on every criticism, and nothing happens, or it happens so slowly because you have massive lobbying power. Whether it's Germany, whether it's the United Kingdom, even in the United States, less than the United States. Let's admit it. But they succeeded. You can find the Putin fingerprints. Speaking about Russian money, trace of Russian money everywhere. From Baltic states to San Francisco, and that was a part of a plan. And having this kind of influence, just helps to pull the strings that are invisible for the public. It's not, just direct approach. It's not like military attack, but hybrid war is effective because Putin has access to more resources than probably any individual in human history. So he can throw billions and billions and billions of dollars buying influence. And he knows it helps him because even if he spends $10 billion, $20 billion on buying these favors, soccer, basketball clubs, whatever, just, it's the TV stations, whatever he can have his hands on, it pays off. It pays, it's with profit, because it helps him to preserve hundreds of billions of dollars that have been stolen in Russia and allocate elsewhere, and to protect this. And this is the core of his power. He had his deal with Russian elite. So you can steal in Russia, you can place money elsewhere in the world, and I guarantee you protection. Many, many years ago, I said that Putin's motto was to rule like Stalin and to live like Abramovich. So that's kind of the dualism that symbolizes Putin's mafia regime, and sports washing proved to be in terms of this return. It's not a direct return. It's not I invested, I promoted my company, but it's a return in stability of my position in the free world where I have to keep my money. So it's proved to be very effective. That's why you had so many followers.
Excellent. It's a form of stability then for Putin and consistency in prolonging it. So Interestingly, as you use the term mafia, I'm immediately thinking of the Saudi monarchy as well, in the way they operate. Though they seem to have an overarching goal of, independence from oil, moving away from their oil dependence. The whole point behind their Vision 2030, which they since have been investing in, entertainment and sports, etc. Now, over the past 3 years, we've seen Saudi really jump into this as they realize, oh no, our oil supplies are about to run out, which means our money and our lifestyle is about to change. We have to do something about it. Miguel, my question for you is, we have now seen in football, we've seen the UAE get involved, as you've mentioned. We've seen Qatar get involved, as you mentioned. We've seen Russia involved. There's going to be plenty more examples to come. Is Saudi any different than those examples? Do you see it as any different? Do you see it as a more harmful example, or do you see it on the same level as what we're already dealing with?
I think it's a very interesting question, because that's something that came up an awful lot in the discussion of the attempted takeover of Newcastle. And even before that, when it had been mooted that they might be interested in buying Manchester United. And I think, because if you compare all the discussion around the Saudi takeover of Newcastle to 11 years prior, when Abu Dhabi effectively bought Manchester City, or Sheikh Mansour, however you want to phrase it, or the exact links. There was almost no questioning of that. It felt like a much more naive football world, whereas basically it was just seen as kind of oil wealth from the Middle East. Now, of course, I don't think that was really challenged until the last few years. Maybe some of that is kind of the spillover from all of the discussion about the Qatar World Cup in 2022. But then from about 2017 on, I think this is particularly due to the work of people like Nick McGeehan, where there was a lot more focus on what exactly Abu Dhabi wanted with Manchester City. And as we've already discussed on the as part of this discussion, it was ultimately kind of a form of, it's about growing influence, it's about wealth diversification, and also about kind of continuing business as normal at the West, but without having questions asked. One of the arguments you often hear about justifying, say, the potential Saudi Arabian takeover of Newcastle is that, well, maybe it can have an effect going the other way. Maybe it actually improves human rights records in these countries. Whereas the Abu Dhabi example proves that to be absolutely bogus. As so many academics have pointed out to me, the human rights situation in Abu Dhabi or in the UAE is much worse in 2020 than it was in 2008. So in that sense, the ownership of Manchester City has had a negligible effect. But on the other side, the Abu Dhabi hierarchy have been able to kind of further their business relationships with the West and with the UK to the point that they're just part of the language, part of the visibility of football. And I think maybe with the Newcastle Saudi Arabia thing, this is something that kept coming up. Where basically it was seeing that Abu Dhabi are much more sophisticated at this than Saudi Arabia, and it's why there hasn't been the same discussion. Their PR apparatus is just much better at it. And with Saudi Arabia, I think it's just been seen as much cruder. But also, I suppose, an added element to that is, whereas kind of for pointing to kind of human rights abuse, even though this should be ludicrous to say, but I think it's true, it can often seem a little bit abstract for people. Whereas with Saudi Arabia, when you can point to kind of examples like the tragic murder of Khashoggi, or also capital punishment, it's much more visible for people. And for that, and in that sense, I think Saudi Arabia was probably seen as, without using language that's too simplistic, it was probably seen as the big bad in terms of the whoever was going to buy a football club next.
And it's interesting because I find that there's a lot of similarities with China as well, in that China seems to have this approach where there's nationalism involved in it, there's business interests involved in it, and it's a little hard to gauge what's next exactly. I find that Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, it's an easy path to understanding where their their goals lie, their objectives, the way they go about it. When it comes to China, they have their hands and their fingers in so many different things at the moment. I can't quite understand the overarching goal, if there even is one. Maybe I'm looking too much into it. Maybe I'm taking an academic lens here. But I see nationalistic fervor. I see pressure to change international image. I see forms of control. What do you think, Eraide? What do you think is the primary overarching interest here for China, and how do they apply it?
I think it's twofold, and I think we could talk about China as in the CCP as a whole, and then talk about Xi Jinping as, I guess, the lifelong dictator at this point. And I think Xi Jinping, and unlike Gary was mentioning about Putin, is that he does want to leave a legacy. He finds it very important that he becomes this leader that took China from, a developing country to a world leader. That's I think his end goal is to make himself seem that he has now taken China and made a 180 and made it grow. And I think that is actually one of the reasons that the citizens and the country itself also supports this, right? There's a lot of nationalism that's associated with it, as you mentioned. And I think that Xi Jinping really plays into this, saying, you'll see a lot on their media talking about any time the US or other Western countries attack China's human rights standards, China will immediately respond back with, oh, these Western countries don't want China to be included in being a world leader, in making conversation and sitting at the table with other leaders. And they're consistently spreading this dialogue of that it's racism at the end of the day. They're constantly playing into that they're not including China in the conversation, even though China should be in the conversation and they're deserving of it. And you'll see this in, and one of the examples kind of going back to the NBA, when Daryl Morey spoke out about it, one of the in CCTV, they specifically gave a very clear threat where it said that Chinese Rocket fans are first Chinese. We love Chinese red more than the Rockets red. Morey, this time you really fouled. If you foul, you have to pay the price. And what's the price? The price is the Chinese market. The price is the access to the billions of Chinese people that are there, that now this whole market is going to be closed off to them. And they create this very close, tight-knit between these two things, right? The market that people want to get into because it's very, very economically beneficial. It's very beneficial to be in China right now just because of their mass populations, where people are able to afford a lot and are willing to pay and willing to get into these interests. And at the same time, they also have this requirement that you have to be supporting of the CCP. So now the general population and the Chinese Communist Party are now inseparable. They're one. And if you insult one, then it means immediately that you're insulting another, which isn't true, right? These are two completely different things. When we're talking about human rights, when we're talking about government policies, we're talking about the CCP and the injustices that they're doing, not the Chinese people as a whole. But what the CCP has done is created this connect that if they insult us, they're insulting all Chinese people, which is completely false. And I think they use that to continue to strengthen nationalism, and they use that to create, to try to put themselves at the table, but at the same time, make it sure that it's on their own terms. And when I say they, the CCPs.
It's very interesting what you say there about that counter argument from China about, the accusation of racism, because it immediately made me think of something because basically that becomes quite a useful defence for them and a quite preemptive defence. But immediately made me think of in the summer of 2019, when the president of the Spanish League, Javier Tebas, he was talking, I suppose, about the disruptive effect of money in football, with that money particularly coming from Qatar with Paris Saint-Germain and Abu Dhabi with Manchester City. And I just have the quotes here. Manchester City's chairman, Khaldoon Al-Mubarak, who is, some people call him the de facto prime minister of Abu Dhabi, and he's chairman of the club. But he spoke about how his exact lines were he said there's something deep. He talked about kind of Tebas bringing up the money behind Paris Saint-Germain and Manchester City and said, there's something deeply wrong in bringing ethnicity into the conversation. This is just ugly. The way he's combining teams because of ethnicity, I find that very disturbing, to be honest. When, of course, that's not actually what's happened. And it's... But even beyond that, one thing... So, say when you're writing an article, basically, about these topics, one of the most common responses you get from supporters of these clubs, and that's worth going into in itself. But one of the most common responses you get is, "Oh, this is racism against who's allowed to invest in football, or certain types of people invest in football." And again, it just all feels a preemptive defence to kind of deflect from the real criticisms here. And it's interesting how supporters, I suppose, just parrot these lines, because that's something else that's happening here. By tapping into the emotional connection people have with their clubs or their teams, they're basically just buying almost unwitting public support, and people are, and it does mean if you go on Twitter, people like thousands of people doing unpaid work basically in terms of public relations for these states, and I do find that that's what makes it really insidious, I think, and it's really such an unfortunate and almost tragic consequence of this.
Well, you raise a very, very great point there about how the fans handle these things, and the role sort of both fans, journalists, everybody has to play in this, and how fans, they seem to not understand the subliminal messaging going on and end up presenting this sort of free PR. So I want to go further into this and talk about, now that we know how sports washing works and how it affects the fans, how it affects people, and how all these dictatorships win from it, what can we do about it? What are the solutions? I mean, Gary, you had mentioned that you don't really think sanctions against Putin or against Russia work very well. So if not sanctions, then what's an example? I think of sanctions sometimes because very recently, the UFC was known to have ties with Ramzan Kadyrov, the dictator in Chechnya, Chechnya being a republic within Russia. And he was actually sanctioned by the United States. Specifically his MMA fight club and his football team, both were sanctioned. And that's really impacted him to the point that he's very, very irritated about this because he can no longer present himself, update his image, etc. But does that apply to, the bigger guys? Because when we talk about Kadyrov, he's a lot more localized. He's a domestic force. Does that really apply to a Putin? Does that apply to Saudi, etc.? What do you think, Gary?
I did not say that sanctions did not work. I said that the sanctions, were not implemented at the level where they could hurt Putin, because there are sanctions and sanctions. And what we have now, what is called sanctions, it's more than lip service, but it's less than real sanctions that could force people around Putin to start thinking about the consequence of their actions. So sanctions against Roman Abramovich, that's something that we have been calling for a long time. Just do that. I mean, you have a long list of people. Usmanov, that's another Russian billionaire, with an interest in football. So there's a lot that can be done, but this, that's not a decision that stays only with politicians. This is also about public. And it's very important for public to recognize that this is not just money, and money coming from another source. And there's no element of racism or nationalism saying these people cannot invest, these people can invest. It's not about the ethnicity of money. It's about, I would say, it's the moral quality of money. If it's a well-earned money, it can come from anywhere. But if this money comes from the source that we know is owned by a dictator, by people who not just committed crimes, but they keep committing crimes, as this money being used to buy their influence and to clear their names in the eyes of millions and millions of sport fans, that's another story. And until we can convey the message to the Western public at large, for people to look at the consequences of their inaction, or in some cases, their action of defending these human rights abusers, nothing will change. Because NBA or Premier League or French, Italian, German clubs, they look for, at the end of the day, for benefits. Those clubs are just commercial entities, and they have to make money at the end of the day, and they see no downside. And that's what's happening with NBA. They all are proactive in America. because they know that American public, wants them to be proactive. Good. How about being 10% that proactive, attacking heinous crimes that have nothing, to compare with injustice in America? So the moment they will see that the money actually could go down, the moment that they could see that advertising contracts could be in jeopardy, that will talk business. Because at the end of the day, no matter how much money China could bring in, if American advertising market, European advertising market will start pointing out at the at these amoral things and will put this dilemma on the table, I think everything will change. And by the way, that will also affect Chinese, Saudis, Russians, and others, because they will see, it's no longer the same game. Because with all Russian and Chinese and Saudis money, the moment you will look at American advertising market and all the contracts that these players these players earn there, it could be a different story. But we need public to start looking at the human rights abuses in the countries that we are discussing here today, and that's not the end of the list, of course, and to convey the message to their sport heroes not to be indifferent to the sufferings of people around the world.
Well, there's an interesting, just on exactly what you're talking about. I've already heard stories about certain big name footballers who have refused multi-million-pound sponsorships from Saudi Arabia, not linked to clubs, but just basically these kind of tourism contracts. That and I've heard that some have rejected it basically because of these exact concerns. Because if they go into business like that, then it will affect them in other areas. People will look at them negatively, and you would hope, I suppose, maybe that represents the start of a bigger conversation. Although sometimes it can be disheartening to see the number of kind of football figures or sporting figures who you would otherwise look up to, and they still kind of have some financial relationships or deals with questionable interests or states in that way. I mean, especially you only have to look at the way so many football clubs go to Abu Dhabi or Dubai for training camps and all the rest of it. But in terms of, just I suppose before addressing what we can do, I think it's also worth mentioning in terms of the supporters and that power that we see. I do have a certain sympathy for supporters. And I remember when Saudi Arabia were trying to buy Newcastle, I remember hearing that one of the reasons they picked Newcastle and why it actually became more attractive than a global behemoth like Manchester United was specifically because Newcastle have been starved of success for the last few years. That they haven't won a major trophy since the 60s, or haven't won a domestic trophy for even longer. So suddenly, there's all sorts of goodwill immediately purchased if these new owners deliver success in that way, but buying all sorts of loyalty. And from that, and I suppose there is a certain sympathy for supporters in that sense. So you've been supporting your club for decades. It's a huge part of your life. It's part of your identity. And then suddenly that identity is complicated because it's not just a football club anymore. It's also an apparatus for a state. And I think that I think it's probably natural people get defensive about that. But of course, that's why I think media discussion needs to be more prominent. And this is something I remember wrestling a lot with when Manchester City won the treble in England in May 2019, and they completed it by absolutely thrashing Watford 6-0 in the final. And I remember kind of thinking to myself during that game, should I really be, just the scale of this is a bit, there's something different there. I'm not sure I should be reporting this as a straight big team beats little team and wins by 6-0. I think we have to go to the next level and discuss what this all means, which is essentially what the whole point of the Manchester City project is. And I think got me thinking in terms of, as the media are probably inadvertently doing the job of these regimes or interests if we just basically mention this as sport as usual without really referencing the kind of point behind it or referencing the interests or what exactly is going on here. And it's interesting.
There should always be a disclaimer.
Exactly. And it's interesting, but again, pointing to what we're talking about, usually just as an example, usually would say Qatar and PSG or Manchester City and Abu Dhabi. I usually always make a point about pointing to the level of investment and where the investment has come from in every. And even if you put in one sentence, you get huge backlash for that because because of all the reasons we're talking about here.
So, right, as an activist yourself, you see this fan reaction, and you see how Miguel used some fantastic examples, specifically Newcastle United, when you have fans really just begging and dreaming and desperate for a win and desperate to see success, and they're willing to overlook anything else. This sort of level of willful ignorance, where they know there are atrocities involved and they know there's dark money, etc., involved in this, but they don't care because it means victory and euphoria for them. What sort of activism and outreach actually works to, alter this fan perception? How can we move forward in that sense?
I think there's two things. Obviously, a lot of this does come from ignorance. So you'll see a lot of, for example, with the whole NBA situation again, a lot of them claimed ignorance. I didn't know about the situation, so I can't really speak on it. So a lot of it is just making sure that the public is knowledgeable on it. Whether if they choose to be ignorant, at least it's in the back of their minds and they know enough. So talking about it more, making sure that it's always a part of the conversation and mentioned. So journalists and people who are reporting on sports are constantly at least giving that caveat, like, yes, we're talking about this, the Olympics, for example, happening in Beijing in 2022, but just remember that this is happening right next door. And just making sure that while people see this beautiful image in one hand, they also realize all of the things that come along with that. And then the other aspect, I think, would be to making sure by making sure that businesses associated, people who are spokespersons, these athletes that are coming out and trying to promote these events, whether it's the NBA within China or the Olympics, just making sure that they are taking that leadership role. And I think one of the biggest parts of activism is making sure that these role models essentially are making sure that their voices are being put to this. So we're constantly reaching out and making sure that whether it's the IOC or whether it's the Olympic athletes or the sponsors, whether it's businesses like Nike or athletes like LeBron, they are at least going to say something about it and make sure that their voices aren't being put to nothing, that their voices aren't being used for the Chinese Communist Party or the dictatorship that they're working with, but used to at least enlighten those people. I think especially in the situation with China, since the people's nationalism and the people's thoughts are so important, and the fact that historically, U.S. and Western countries took the approach to China that the more we interact with them, the more that we're allowed into China's borders, the more we can change people's minds. And we've kind of failed at it, really. We've failed completely in trying to interact with China and trying to change their minds to making sure that human rights is a big priority of theirs. We've failed at it. And I think the leaders that do now have access to China need to start saying these things, or at least pulling out a little bit. There's people like Mark Cuban who have said, I'm going to continue doing business with China as usual. There's people, like LeBron that says, I don't really know about it, so I'm just going to continue what I'm doing as of now. There's Thomas Bach who claims we're apolitical, so the Olympics are apolitical. But if these people started pulling out, that would enlighten the people within China, enlighten Chinese citizens to saying, hey, why are we being deprived from these amazing things? What's going on here? What's happening? And that would end up making them question what their government's doing and what their governments are acting. Because at the end of the day, without the Chinese population being involved in this conversation, the Chinese government isn't going to change and the genocide is going to continue happening. And without role models, especially from the West, who claim to, really support humanity and equality, without them speaking out, that mindset isn't going to change.
In order to actually reach these businesses and these fans, how do you really amplify this message? Now, I specify to both because, Gary, you as the chairman of the Human Rights Foundation, how do you approach something like this? And Miguel, what role do you see media in activism? So when I grew up as a journalist, I saw myself as a distinctly separate from an activist. The more I touch on these topics, the more I see myself as an educational role. Do you share this understanding of this? Do you share this activist mentality? How do you go about this?
Well, I think it's interesting you draw. I mean, I would be along your line of thinking, but also I think what reflects that as well is, I mean, traditionally with issues like this, with say, and this goes back even, I think, to maybe some of the absence of discussion around Manchester City in 2008, or even any example you want to think of. There would always be seen as a kind of a separation between the kind of, say, news pages or international news and sport, whereas they'd cover that side of it, we'd cover the just the football matches or the actual sport. When I don't think, and I think you can see it from just the way sports coverage has changed in the last few years. I don't think that applies anymore, and one of the reasons it doesn't apply, of course, because we're not just reporting on kind of the sporting results, the rest of it. What we also have to report on is, and what is central to all of this, is the importance of sport to society. I mean, that's why we're even covering them in the first place, because of how much this all means to people. Hence, we need to be covering the issues around these teams and whether they're being used, whether they're being, the exact kind of nature of people wanting to buy clubs or influences in football. And I think, I do have to say, I think that is something that has really accelerated in the last decade. And I feel sports coverage has grown up a lot in that regard over the past while. But obviously, I think more evolution is required as well. And this is something that should be, and again, I think you'd have to argue, it should be front and centre, really. And on that, actually, the Qatar World Cup is going to provide quite an interesting experiment and maybe challenge for sport as well. And that, I mean, and Russia was along these lines as well. But I think maybe Qatar is even on another level, because there's been so much discussion about how the construction of stadiums and the death of migrant workers in general construction in Qatar. I mean, so even if you say when Liverpool went to Qatar for the Club World Cup just over a year ago, there was all sorts of discussion about whether they could go to an hotel, or whether the team could stay in a hotel that is considered ethical. And they did receive advice from human rights organisations on this. And I think it's going to be interesting to see how sports coverage covers the Qatari World Cup in that regard, and how much we kind of just recover the great show, which I suppose the Qatari state would want, and how much the great show is actually going to be used to also cover all the connected issues with it, because the two should be interlinked. And I think that's certainly one way the media should be helping here. I think it touches on what you're saying in terms of kind of helping people understand.
You talked a lot about 2022 Qatar World Cup, and the previous World Cup was in Russia. And then it's just, it was a symbol of corruption. There's so much money has been stolen. They just, most of the construction's already falling apart. It's okay. I'm sure Qatar, the quality in Qatar will be higher, but again, the principle is the same. So Putin bought it. So they knew how to buy these favors, or the bits from international sport organizations. And you had the FIFA officials, just hugging, kissing, and just, By the way, they just, they don't care, football, chess, because the man is the former deputy prime minister, Arkady Dvorkovich, the right-hand man of former President Medvedev, who was the head of the organizing committee for World Cup in Russia. Now he's the president of FIDE, International Chess Federation. At the end of the day, they look at this at every institution, whether it's basketball, football, chess, is a way to spread their influence. And going back to the repercussions, to what is the payoff? Did this Disney pay any price for shooting Mulan in Xinjiang? No. So it's as if we have actual genocide happening in Xinjiang now. We have massive violations of human rights just in countries. We can we don't have enough time in the program to start even counting these countries. Even Khashoggi, it's even by medieval standards, that's one of the worst killing, murder, ordered by a head of the state, or that's de facto head of the state, and we have enough evidence that he most likely was even watching it live. But as you probably aware, HRF sponsored the movie The Dissident, produced by Brian Fogel, about Khashoggi and his fight and his tragic death, and we couldn't find a media outlet that was ready to promote it. So this is a power of Saudi's money. So it's very important for us to mobilize the public. it's not just one-off event, Liverpool in Qatar, or someone goes to a country where you have to be cautious not to be seen by having it's a war hug with a dictator, but it's about the overall rejection of the money that's coming from these sources, this dark money that is earned in blood and tears of innocent people.
And honestly, because I believe we are out of time, I think that's a great way to conclude this panel. Thank you all very much for your wonderful insight. It was a pleasure moderating this panel.